Good afternoon, everybody. So, I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I'm very passionate about. And I've been in the field now for 24 years. I started out as a technician for an engineering firm, basically building, wiring, and testing, and helping out on FAT testing of control cabinetry for water treatment facilities. But over the last 16 years of my career, I've been focused primarily on doing penetration tests of OT environments and trying to identify ways to do it safely inside of a production environment, but also how to develop new methodologies to be able to do testing of OT equipment in lab settings. So that way vendors or owner-operators can actually test the equipment before they actually put it into production. So with that, let's go ahead and start talking a little bit about testing. So before we get into penetration testing, let's talk about security assessments in general. There are many different types of security assessments that we can do inside of our OT environments to try to identify risks and try to identify different attack paths an attacker might try to take for an environment. Each of the different assessment types focuses on a different type of information or a different set of facts. So if we go ahead and we look, right, some assessment types are going to be using some type of a human understanding via interviews, sitting down, talking to engineers to try to understand what are the high risks or what could an attacker do for some type of an environment. And some assessment types might focus on this, things like audits or architecture reviews, or assessment types that focus and use the information learned from interviews to determine your risks for these environments. Other types of assessment types might look at documentation from the vendor or documentation from some type of architecture team inside of a company. Some assessment types might use configurations from the devices themselves to try to determine what risks or vulnerabilities are present. Other types of assessments might query or interact with communication interfaces to be able to identify different types of vulnerabilities. So there's lots of different types of vulnerabilities that are present, okay, in these systems. We have not figured out how to build a complex system that does not have vulnerabilities. And the more types of assessments we can use, the more types of vulnerabilities we can identify. So when we think about vulnerabilities, I like to think about, or when we talk about assessments, I like to think about assessments kind of laid out in this simple little chart that I have up here, where some types of assessments are going to be focused more on passive mechanisms where they're not interacting with our systems, which are generally safe, right? If you use assessment types that are more passive in nature, we're actually decreasing risk, we're not taking any risk of the OT environment, and are able to find some level of vulnerabilities. Other types of assessment types, like vulnerability scanning or penetration tests, tend to be more of an active type assessment type, right? So more towards the bottom of this table. Anytime that we are using an assessment type that actively interacts with the equipment, we are taking some level of risk to the OT environment. Now the question is, when should we take that risk? When should we not take that risk? And if we choose to take that risk for the environment, how do we minimize that risk as much as we possibly can so that we can choose what level of risk we're taking in our assessment and try to match that to whatever the risk we are comfortable taking in that OT environment? Because some OT environments we shouldn't take any risks on. Other OT environments we may be able to take a little bit of risk on. And that's something we have to try to determine and change how we do these assessments for these environments, because each of these assessment types can be modified for the specific type of environment you're going to be interacting with or assessing, right? So we can modify how these different types of assessments actually work to make them fit the environment and fit the risk that we are willing to take for these on these systems and these networks. Now, when it comes to penetration testing, what is a penetration test? So a penetration test is a type of an assessment which is a little different than most types of assessments, because a penetration test is going to use tools that the attackers use, or at least similar types of tools, and also use similar types of techniques. And the goal of a penetration test is to find vulnerabilities. Okay? Penetration tests are not red team assessments. Many people today get red teaming and penetration tests confused, right? Because they use the same types of tools. However, red teaming exercises is primarily used to try to test your defenses and your blue team's reactions. Red teaming assumes that somebody is actively defending and the red team is trying to get through or try to test those environments, right? And trying to do it very carefully. Where a penetration test is not about the presence of a blue team or not. Usually if you're doing a penetration test, you're telling the blue team or the defenders that you're doing it, right? And the goal is to try to find as many vulnerabilities as we can inside of that environment. So with the penetration test, another unique element of it is a penetration test exercises exploits inside of these systems to try to measure the realistic risk of these vulnerabilities. That's something that sets penetration testing aside from something like vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scans will identify the vulnerability, but does not exploit the vulnerability. Okay? Penetration testing does do that exploitation. Now, what are the benefits? Why would we even want to consider doing some of these penetration tests? So when we do a penetration test, there are elements of a penetration test or features of a penetration test that provide goals or provide benefits to us that are very different than the other assessment types. So a penetration test is going to look at all the different components we have that we have chosen to be within scope, and they're going to be looking at those components as an interconnected whole. That's very different than many other types of assessments, like an audit, right? Or a configuration review, where they're looking at just one single picture of that one single asset and making assumptions on its presence or what those configurations have to everything else. A penetration test actually is interacting with all the components that you have chosen to be within scope and how they've actually been deployed inside that real environment. Okay? The penetration tests also test the effectiveness of the defenses, because when we have a component with configurations, the configurations may have hardened or tried to make that device harder to compromise, but we may have added additional defenses on top of that. When we're doing a penetration test, we'll be able to test the effectiveness of those defenses as well, which once again is that layered element of the environment, testing it as that whole. The other benefit of penetration tests is it avoids assumptions. Quite often, when we are doing an interview with an engineer or we are looking at the configurations of a device, we are making assumptions for how that's been configured or how it's been placed inside of an environment. Penetration tests are looking at the real thing, interacting with the real configurations. Okay? Sometimes when we actually choose a setting or a configuration in a security panel, right, that configuration may not be doing something in the real world that you think it's actually doing. In fact, quite often when we do penetration tests of equipment from vendors, one of the things we do is we look at the security features that the vendor claims to have, and as our penetration test, we create checkboxes for each security feature, and as part of our penetration test, we actually test to see if that security feature is actually present in the system. And I can tell you right now, it is very common that we find at least one security feature that's either not present in the system that the vendor claims that is present, or that security feature is not configured in a way that the vendor represents inside of their documentation. Okay? It measures a more realistic level of risk through that exploitation. That's one of the benefits of exploiting it, to try to identify how the component fails. And it discovers additional layers, second and third layers of vulnerabilities. Because when you have a single component or a system, right, that system or that component is made up of several layers of technologies. When you look at configurations for a component that a vendor has provided to you, right, those configurations are of that system as a whole. But that system as a whole is made of several different technological layers. And through penetration testing, if you find a vulnerability in that very first defense, you can start testing the second layer or the third layer of the technologies that are there, things that are not normally exposed, right, or things that you could even see or detect through other means and other assessment types. Okay? And it also goes through and allows us to go through and just get that full, complete picture of the system. Now, when we do penetration tests, we should be doing penetration tests in a gray box or a crystal box method. So if you've ever heard of this before, a lot of times people talk about a black box penetration test. Okay? A black box penetration test usually implies that the testing team knows no information about the asset, right? Sometimes owner-operators or companies like the idea of a black box penetration test because they're kind of giving that testing team, right, the same type of perspective that a real attacker would have. But please don't do that, okay? The goal for a penetration test is to find vulnerabilities. If that's the primary goal, then we should try to spend the least amount of money, right, to get the most value out of the penetration test. So when we do a penetration test, you want to provide the testing team with information that attackers don't have, because it's going to make the testing team more efficient in finding the vulnerabilities inside of that, and overall allow that team to find more vulnerabilities and spend less time doing it, which means less cost for the teams that already have very limited budgets. Okay? Give them access to administration interfaces on the devices that are there. The administration interface may not be part of the penetration test. That may not be in scope to find vulnerabilities. But if you provide that interface to the pen testing team, it allows the penetration testing team to be able to validate or to check to see if some of their attacks that are working. Because a penetration testing team are going to be using similar or the same tools that attackers are using, right? And those are what we generally call black box tools. It's something that is just using an interface into a system, that's usually a closed system, and evaluating the responses coming back out, right? So if we allow our penetration testing team to log in and see inside of the system, it allows them to be more effective with the tuning or the creation or the configurations of those black box pen testing tools they can use, and they can then try to identify if these tools actually can effectively find or exploit some type of a vulnerability inside of the system that's there. Now, when it comes to penetration tests, there are many different types of penetration tests that we can perform. It's not just a pen test. You have to decide what systems or components are you going to be doing in a penetration test, and to what depth or degree do we want to try to find vulnerabilities in these systems. Because penetration test is an active type scan or an active assessment, and depending on what types of probes or information we're sending into these systems, it can be very detrimental. Some techniques and some methods that we use when we do penetration tests are destructive to the systems, right? So we need to be very, very careful on what types of techniques we're using, depending on the types of environments or the type of tests we want to perform. My recommendation is always think of penetration testing as two major different groups. We have one major group that's on the top of this slide, which is our production assessments. These are types of penetration tests or assessments we can do to a production environment, right, that has already been commissioned, it's already passed its SAT testing, and we want to go through and do some level of assessment or penetration test of that environment. And we'll talk a little bit later on about when we should do this and how we make this safe for that environment. But when we do these production assessments or penetration tests in these production assessments, we want to make sure that the types of actions we take are safe for that environment and are not doing any destructive techniques, right? And that we are doing as much due diligence as we possibly can to make sure that we're not going to interfere with production, we're not going to interfere or harm the systems, right? So it's going to be very different. And the penetration tests that we do that we'll get into a little bit later are going to be similar to what a network penetration test would be in an IT environment, but it's going to be highly modified, right? It's going to be greatly changed to try to be safe for that environment. Now, there's a whole different category of penetration tests that we can perform, which is that lower group, which are going to be more the lab assessments, where we take some component or some solution, put it into a lab type setting, and then we can go through and do a greater depth of penetration test to find the vulnerabilities. These lab assessments are what vendors should be doing before they go to market and sell their tools. These same lab assessments are things that owner-operators can do before they actually deploy the equipment inside of their environment. So if they have some type of a new component, they want to check to see what types of vulnerabilities are present in it before they deploy it, they could put it into their own lab and do this level of work inside of their own facilities, or possibly do these lab assessments as part of their purchasing process. You're looking at a solution. There's two solutions that meet the engineering requirements for our environment from two different vendors. To help us try to decide between the two, you could take demos of both of those equipment, put it in a lab setting, and have the owner-operator do penetration tests on both to try to use the information found in the penetration test to help influence or make the decision on which solution to go with. Okay? And as we can see inside of them, the little sections inside are examples. So our firm does different types of penetration tests, and these are the names that we tend to use for a lot of the types of penetration tests. So things that we could actually do more of a lab type setting would be this controller logic. So if I have some field device that has built-in logic to it, or maybe a PLC that some engineer has programmed, and we want to try to identify if there's any logic flaws or coding mistakes that have been made, very similar to like the document that Sarah created 2 years ago on the top 20 coding recommendations for our controllers, right? That's the type of assessment we would do, right? How we could go in and actually try to validate if there's vulnerabilities in that logic in whatever type of controller or field device that's there. We could go through and we can do penetration testing of the control protocols. So any of the common control protocols that's implemented, we can do fuzzing of those control protocols, we can do man in the middle of those control protocols, we can do other types of interactions to try to identify what flaws exist either in that standard or in the implementation of that protocol inside of that device. We can go ahead and look at proprietary serial protocols, because a lot of our devices may have a maintenance interface that we connect a serial port to be able to configure that device. We can go ahead and assess that and look at that proprietary serial protocol. And part of that penetration test would be reverse engineering the proprietary protocol, building a testing harness so that we can start interacting with and fuzzing that proprietary protocol. We can do the same thing with proprietary RF protocols or any other type of proprietary protocol that we have in these environments. We can also go through and look at embedded tests or embedded storage. So on our embedded devices, a lot of times they'll have flash and EEPROM, and they'll store different types of configurations or firmware inside of them. We can go through and try to assess those to try to identify what vulnerabilities might be present. And this embedded, either one of the two embeddeds I have up there, generally are going to be more of a destructive type assessment because we're interacting with the circuit boards and pulling the devices apart. And anytime you pull a device apart and you open the device up, it should never be placed back into production. In fact, when we do this for customers, we actually recommend to the customers before they ship the devices to us to remove the devices from their inventories, right? And then we'll go ahead and discard the product for them, or if they request, we can go ahead and send that product back, sometimes in pieces, right, after our assessment, for them to be able to discard however they see fit. So if you want more information on these different assessment types, you can go over to controlthings.io. This is an open project community site that I actually run with a whole bunch of open source tools. And you can get some more information over on controlthings.io for these different assessment types. And I also teach a course, and these are some of the modules or the sections we actually teach in the course. Now, before all these assessment types, notice that I do have one security assessment called a Security Architecture Review that is listed before them, kind of shows that it's a precursor. This is something we always recommend, to do a security architecture review first before we do any of these other types of assessment types. Now, what is a SAR, or a security architecture review? Okay, like I said, this is something we recommend doing before any of the other types of assessments. The easiest way that I find to describe what a SAR is, and the way I think about it in my head, is, to me, a security architecture review is simply a pen and paper penetration test. It's something where I'm sitting down with engineers, or sitting down with architects for a company, or sitting down with the sales engineers from some type of a vendor, and asking them questions and reviewing their documentation, trying to look at what's the attack surface of this component. If I was doing a penetration test, how would I attack it? And to me, a security architecture review is, instead of using a tool to find the vulnerability, I ask questions, right, to an engineer, or I ask questions to myself as I read the documentation, and I try to get the answers that my tools would normally do. So instead of port scanning to find which assets are present, I ask a question to an engineer, which devices are present inside this environment? Or maybe I ask an engineer, right, can you give me an asset inventory list of this environment or of this network? It gives me the same type of information that I would run if I was doing a penetration test, right? But this is something that's absolutely no risk. Okay, so that's one of the benefits of doing a SAR long before you do a penetration test. When we're working with this, we're working with network diagrams, asset inventories, we're working with configurations of the devices. Sometimes during an interview, I'll always recommend that the person I'm interviewing bring their laptop with them. And if I have a question that they don't know immediately off the top of their head, we'll often have them open up their laptop and find that information for me. If they don't have a complete network diagram, then we open up the whiteboard and we get out the dry erasers and we start going through and writing on the whiteboard, mapping out their environment or their network. Or if they have a network diagram but it's incomplete, I grab their network diagram that I pre-printed out before the interview and I get a pen and I start modifying it, right? And adding the missing components that are there. So once again, to me, as a penetration tester, I'm asking questions as if I was doing a penetration test. I think of where would I start as the tester, where am I trying to get to, and I simply ask the same questions that I normally would use my tools to try to find those information. Now, what a SAR is not. A SAR is not an audit. Okay? An audit is generally something where you have a big giant list of checkboxes. And the checkboxes all come from some type of a standard, something like OTCEP or IEC 62443 that allows us to go through and has recommendations of what should be present, and we are going through and we're looking at evidence or documentation or configurations to try to identify if those are present. An audit generally is a very long exercise. They can take sometimes a week or many weeks to be able to perform some type of an audit. And they tend to focus more on like what I would call a medium level of depth, because they're looking at the configurations of the devices. Most audits are focused on the configurations or checking if you have some type of a manual process that are present. And I think one of the disadvantages of an audit is while we get a lot of good information of an audit, they tend to not consider the components, how they're actually connected inside of the environment, which would be kind of that higher level architecture level. Nor does an audit really consider about the lower level, which is how the protocols or the technology stacks have been implemented inside of the system. Now, when we do a security architecture review, one of the benefits of a security architecture review is it's measured in days, not weeks. When I do a security architecture review, I usually will spend anywhere from 2 to 4 days to do a security architecture review, sometimes with a single person, sometimes with 2 people. I don't think I've ever done a security architecture review longer than 5 days with 2 people. So that's something that's a very big benefit. The security architecture review is not going to try to identify all the flaws and try to boil the ocean and find everything. A security architecture review is focusing on high risk, high likelihood attacks. What is the primary ways an attacker would come in? What are the different levels or paths that an attacker could take? What types of defenses do we have in place between those different systems? So the benefit of a security architecture review is it can be done as a standalone assessment. If I have a client approach and say, we want to start doing security assessments of our OT environment, we've never done it before, what do you recommend? Security architecture review. You can go in for a couple days, give you some feedback on what the highest risks are for that environment. Okay? Or a security architecture review can be part of a precursor to doing other types of work that's there. In fact, inside of InGuardians, I have a hard, fast rule that all of our team must complete security architecture reviews before they ever send any packets or interact with any of the systems inside of an environment. And why do we require that? Well, number one, it helps identify risks. When we do penetration tests, we are taking on some type of a risk. Anytime you send packets into an environment, you are taking on some type of a risk. So before we do that, I want my team to do a security architecture review. It helps me identify what are the risks to our client, what are the risks to the environment, what are the risks that the penetration testing company is taking on to be able to do that work? And more importantly, the thing that nobody really talks about, what is the personal risk that you as a penetration tester are taking on your own personal shoulders before you step into that environment to do the penetration test? Because if you make a mistake, it's not just the liability of your company you're working for. It might be the liability of your career. And most of us have dependencies or dependents that require our salaries that we have. So we want to be very, very careful when we start trying to approach to do this type of work. Okay? It also allows us to provide tasks and prioritization for our penetration test team itself, because we can take information from the security architecture review and provide that to the penetration team to allow them to modify how they're actually doing the work. So think of a security architecture review as going into an engagement with your eyes wide open before you start taking risks and pushing traffic into the network or interacting with any of the devices. Now, where do we do penetration tests? So we talked about the different types of penetration tests we can do. Okay? Let's assume that we're talking about production environments. That tends to be the one that most companies are curious and are asking questions about. If you want to do a penetration test of a production environment, right, where are the different locations or areas we can do that on? So we can do that on anything on the perimeter. So anything from the internet to OT or from IT to OT links. Right? There's lots of areas we can go through and do penetration tests inside that environment. We can test the remote access. We can test connectivity between the IT and the OT networks. We can connect links between our OT sites across different types of either public links, like the internet, or semi-public links. What is a semi-public link? To me, a semi-public link is something that is a third-party provider. MPLS, satellite, cellular. When our traffic goes across it, we may have some type of a private link that provider is providing to us, but on their back end, our data is being commingled with other people's data, right? So to me, that's a semi-private or a semi-public link, okay? Another area we can do penetration testing on is inside of OT testing and staging environments. So an area before we go to production, right? Either in a lab type setting where we have it, or some type of a pre-deployment that we go through to try to do that penetration testing on, or possibly maybe even include in some type of a SAT that we're doing, right? But that becomes an area we can do it before we actually go into a production environment. There's lower risk for that environment, but there is still some level of risk because these are OT systems. Does mean you start needing to have people with more specialized capability where the perimeter stuff, you can generally have general IT pen testers test that. There's low risk to the environment. But when you start testing the actual OT inside of these test environments, there is some risk. This is expensive gear. It's actually pretty easy to actually cause problems to some of this gear. So we have to be very careful and make sure we choose the appropriate types of assessments depending on how much, what the purpose of the equipment is that we're actually working with there. Now, the big question is, should we do penetration testing on a production OT environment? Something that's been commissioned, something that's providing benefit or providing value to the company itself. And my recommendation is, well, maybe, right? There's not a hard, fast rule. Because an actual production environment, you are taking on additional risk, the highest level of risks there. And I think we really need to go through and try to determine for the environment you want to test, we have to figure out and determine as a company, do we want to take the risks of testing this environment? And try to ask our questions of what's the worst case scenario that could go wrong by doing an assessment inside of these environments. So in general, wherever the risk is low, we generally recommend considering doing a penetration test. But not just taking penetration testers and unleashing them in the environment. We want to be able to go through and do this in a very careful manner. So some recommendations. If you choose to do a penetration test in a production environment, here's some recommendations to try to help be a little bit more secure in how you're doing it. Number one, only test the equipment in the production environment when the devices are in some type of an idle mode. If you're in manufacturing, don't test the equipment while you're producing products. Okay? If you are in some type of a power generation plant, okay, don't test that generation plant when it's actually providing power to the grid. Wait until you get to a part of the year where that's not required and you actually are not providing power. Bring up the equipment in an idle state. It's not producing, it's not sharing, but we have the equipment on so we can at least interact with it and do a test at that point. Once again, there's still risk. You can still cause problems to this environment, but that's going to help try to minimize some of the risks that are there. Okay? Another recommendation, only interact and only exploit the IT services on the devices. Stay away from the ICS protocols. Okay? We do not usually recommend, if it's a production environment, to interact with the OT protocols. Okay? If you want to interact with OT and ICS protocols, our recommendation is take the equipment into a lab setting. That's the safe way to do it. Okay? We don't generally interact with those. There may be some exceptions to this, depending on our goals or what we're trying to accomplish. We want to be very, very careful with what that is when we actually choose to do it. But we generally don't interact with the OT protocols unless it's absolutely necessary. Identifying the ports opens, okay. If the protocol has the ability to send in a request to identify what protocol or version or serial number or product that's actually behind it, that's generally okay. Okay? But don't go through and try to read all the tags out of it. Okay? Just don't. Save that for a lab environment. Okay? We want to try to be very, very careful. Focus on testing access to the ICS components in your processes, okay? And not necessarily exploiting the OT processes and the OT components that are there. That's better saved for a lab environment. So, like I said, do the exploitation, but exploit the IT protocols to be able to get to a point where you can demonstrate you have access. If you can get to a point where you can demonstrate you have access to reprogram a controller or to write tag values to the controller, don't actually do it, but use that as your goal. We've gotten to a point where we could write to the tags, or we could reprogram the device, or we could recalibrate the settings on this device. And that would be the end goal. right? You wouldn't actually perform it. We'd just demonstrate getting to that point. Now, if we want to further decrease the risk in these environments, okay, know which subnet that you're working on before you start. That's the benefit of doing a security architecture review. And the other thing I would recommend that was on that previous slide, do a network capture assessment. Capture traffic from the network, analyze the PCAP files. Okay? The reason why I like doing network capture assessments, it's not to find vulnerabilities. You can't find most vulnerabilities in a network capture. However, if I do a security architecture review and talk to engineers to learn about the environment, and then I capture the network traffic and analyze the network traffic, I can compare the network traffic, which is a true facts of the environment, and I compare that to my conversations with the engineer. If the PCAP and what I see in the environment lines up with what I discussed with the engineer, I can have fairly high level of confidence going in and doing that penetration test, understanding what I'm going to find. If your PCAP does not match what you talked about with the engineers, you need to go resolve the differences before you ever start sending traffic into the environment. Okay, once again, try to alleviate and mitigate whatever risks you can do before you get into any of these systems. Okay? Test systems slowly. If this is a production environment, make sure engineers and operators are on hand. Make sure they're watching the systems. Do one at a time, going very, very slowly across that environment, especially the first time you do this. If you get to the point where we do this periodically, right, then maybe you can kind of loosen those restrictions of having an engineer and an operator kind of watching what you're doing, or watching the systems, I should say. Be very careful of your tools and what actions they perform. If you're a penetration tester, every feature you turn on in your tool, you should know exactly what type of traffic that's going to send. If you don't know, go spend a couple days with the tool and Wireshark and try to figure out what it actually does, the different configurations. Avoid any problematic actions and never do anything that's going to be a risky action. Okay? If it's something that's a risky action, just don't take the risk, right? Be very, very realistic with what you're going to do. And why should we even considering this? Because there's going to be some level of risk we have to take, right? Well, remember, the reason why we should consider this is attackers attack the production environments. They don't attack our testing and staging environments. So there is benefit to actually working and interacting and testing our production environments. Okay? Also, the testing and staging environments may not exist inside of OT. Major parts of our OT environment don't have testing and staging environments. So sometimes that actual equipment or the actual production environment might be the only thing we can look at. And the testing and staging environments don't usually have the same security controls or maybe not even the same configurations of the environment. That's the beautiful thing if you have virtualization. Anything that's running in a virtual machine is a beautiful thing for penetration testing because we can take the virtual machine, do a live clone of it, and then actually test it. And it's an exact duplicate of the environment. Okay, so that's always a nice thing. Unfortunately, that doesn't help us inside of the OT when we get to the lower levels and we're talking about embedded devices. So now, determine the scopes. If you're going to do this, determine the scope of what you're going to be testing. Are you going to be testing multiple sites? If you are, I would say focus on the connectivity between the sites. Are you going to test one single site? If you're testing a single site, my recommendation is to treat the processes as a whole complete unit. Don't try to go into the process and just focus on that high-level, site-level supervisory and the connectivity between the different processes. Try not to go into the process if you're doing a test of a whole site. If you're going to test just a single product or a single solution or a single process, then focus on that one single solution or process or product that's there. And then when you start getting into the component level, this is usually when we start going into a lab type setting. If you're going to have the whole solution, put the whole solution in the lab or just the component that you're going to be testing inside of the lab. Realize that if you are testing a component of a larger solution, generally that component needs to have communications to the other components, even if they're not in scope. So if you have a management server, a historian, an HMI that's talking to a controller, and the controller is then talking to a whole bunch of field devices, and you're only testing the controller, realize that some tests you can perform on that controller once it's been removed. Other types of assessment types or penetration testing tests may require that connectivity to actually exist. So you have to figure out a way to be able to provide that depending on what types of tests you're going to be doing. Other things to be aware of, realize that there are going to be differences between OT penetration testing and an IT penetration test. Some of the bigger things that I've personally seen is the process to be able to do this, to actually getting the contract accepted, usually is a very, very different, could be much longer. When you sign contracts, it is common inside of OT that an owner-operator may ask you to also sign a contract with the vendor, right? This is also very especially common if the owner-operator is actually purchasing equipment from a vendor and you're testing 2 or 3 products from multiple vendors trying to help decide on which one they're going to buy, then it's actually very common that you have to sign some type of a contract with them. When it comes back into shipping equipment, make sure that there's plenty of time built in the schedule to ship the equipment, and make sure it's pre-configured. Okay, if you're going to test a component, that device has to be initiated to whatever management server or management infrastructure that's actually there. If you're testing an embedded device, you usually cannot test an embedded device that's been shipped to you directly from the manufacturer. It usually has to be initialized to be able to have the configurations appropriate for that environment to be able to do the testing. And this is something that can be very problematic. Even we just had a client over the last couple of weeks that we've been working with a component that we clarified and we validated 3 or 4 times in a row that this has been initiated and connected to a system before they actually shipped it to us. And when we received it, it had not been initialized. So make sure that you actually get that last one done. Okay, just some other final notes to talk about. Always do an architecture review, okay? So architecture review allows us to make sure that we are decreasing that risk for that environment. Sharing the notes and the reports that you actually have with the people doing the penetration test, because the information we learn from the architecture review or the other assessments we do beforehand are going to help give guidance to the penetration test team and also give them information to be more careful, right? Help them understand where the risk lays and how they may need to modify their tests. And then general guidance for anybody doing penetration tests. Know exactly how each feature in your tools work, right? Minimize whatever types of packets you're actually sending in the environment or interactions you're sending into the environment, and include the engineers. Communicate with the engineers. This is not something that should be done without the engineers' input and interacting with the engineers. And to be very honest, if you include the engineers and kind of show the engineers what you're actually doing, quite often engineers are just as interested in what you're actually doing, because engineers make things for a living. They actually make products, right? They actually put things together, and quite often they want to know what's in the middle, what's inside of these different components. So a lot of engineers, if you sit down and just kind of show them what you're doing, are going to be very interested in what you're actually doing in the penetration test. And so with that, I do have a couple of resources and contact information if anybody has any questions up there before we get to our panel. The resources down there at the very bottom, just a couple of resources I have up on the controlthings.io website. One that I do want to call out in particular is a document called Scanning Highly Sensitive Networks. If you want a document that goes through and gives specific recommendations for specific tools, for instance, how to configure Nessus or how to configure Nmap to do scans of the environment, there are some very, very specific recommendations in that document if you're interested. And with that, let's go ahead and go to the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Searle. Let us now invite our moderator for the session, Mr. Chong Rong Hua, Director at the Center for Strategic Infocom Technologies. Mr. Chong, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, very nice to see every one of you here, and I'm very glad that the entire ballroom is full, right? And thank you, Justin, for the very insightful and comprehensive sharing on Pragmatic pen test. So without further ado, I'll invite our further panelists, right? We have Mr. Zachary Tudor, Associate Laboratory Director, National Homeland Security Science, and Idaho National Lab, right? Welcome, Mr. Zach. And follow on, we have Ms. Alternate Mashirova, yeah, Advanced Cybersecurity Architect of Honeywell, and as well as a founder for Women in Cybersecurity. Right. Yeah, in a bit. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so my background is also working on the area of like security testing, penetration testing, and I'm equally excited as you are. So I'm using this opportunity as our moderator to pose some challenging questions to our panelists. And I would like to invite you to join us to ask some of the most challenging questions, to pick on their brain, to find out what are some of their insights, and hopefully some stories to share, right? Do you mind flash the QR code so that the audience can, yeah, thank you. All right. Perhaps while the audience is trying to, figure out what are they going to ask for the panelists later, Yeah, I should probably start the ball rolling. And Mr. Justin early on has emphasized quite significantly on the importance of SAR, Security Architecture Review, right? And I also noticed that Sortanet is the advanced cybersecurity architect in Honeywell. So therefore, I would like to pose to her a question on, to start something simple, right? What would you advise organization on how should they architect their OT systems so that they can be effective in their OT, but at the same time be ready for penetration activities?
Thank you. This is quite challenging question. So this question refers to do the penetration testing in production environment and a running production environment. So when it comes to the security architecture, I think let me go back to the slides which Justin mentioned. You mentioned crystal box, white box, but I prefer old terminology: white box, gray box, and black box. So I think Justin clearly explained this. But from my perspective, I would say to asset owners, define this different types of box to the different levels. For example, and I have seen in my practice where we defined from enterprise level, you can start from black box. Like in enterprise level, you're trying to get the credential or something to get access to the IT DMZ. Once you reach to the OT DMZ, once you reach to the OT DMZ 3.5, then you start gray box. Once you go to the level 3, level 2, you might switch to the white box, or as Justin mentioned, you find it that you can write to the PLC or you can exploit this vulnerability. You can just stop and just report to the asset owners that this vulnerability has been identified. So this way you can do. And in terms of security architecture, here comes 2 points. The first thing is that I have seen is asset owners, before conducting penetration tests to their production environment, the first thing is they have to know their assets very well, which assets are critical, how their assets are segmented, but it doesn't finish with the assets. Application, I mean version of the application. Does it have memory leakage? Because if it has, no matter how secure you scan, you can create a loss of view to the operators. So this is another thing. The third thing that I have observed, for example, from some asset owners' perspective, if they have from particular vendor, they say, okay, the two things I have observed. So the first thing is if they have from particular vendor, let's say the DCS system, since those vendors, they know their system very well and they conduct penetration testing and then don't cause the damage because they are knowledgeable in their systems. And mostly the findings is when the project was handed over to the asset owners, during the maintenance, it comes misconfiguration, misconfiguration in the firewall, so on and so forth. And the second thing I have observed, some asset owners prefer, if they have from one vendor, they want from another company to avoid conflict of interest. But here you're taking the risk that third party might not know the real, your DCS systems, basically.
Thank you. Very insightful sharing. Anything else to add, Mr. Zach or Justin?
I think that's one of the important things is make sure that you're working with the engineers that is responsible for the assets themselves, because there are going to be nuances or risks to that environment that only the engineer is going to know. This is why it's critical that the penetration testing team gets to meet and talk with and interact with that engineer in a security architecture review is what I recommend before they ever start sitting down and sending traffic into the network. And then furthermore, right, especially with the changing the configurations inside of something like a DCS, right, that's why we don't want to interact with the ICS components that are of that. If you want to test the ICS protocols or the implementations or the processes themselves, that's something that's just never going to be safe inside of a production environment. That needs to be done in a lab.
And one of the reasons I point to Justin a couple of times, so what was it? It's in our name, Idaho National Laboratory. Every time he mentioned tests that get done in a laboratory, I'm like, oh yeah, we do that.
Awesome.
We do that over there, and so I don't necessarily ever mess up anybody's production environment or run that risk. We've actually done assessments on Honeywell equipment for many years. There was a former program, the National SCADA Test Bed, and I can happily say that outside of the U.S., because inside the U.S. it's a bad name, because it got a bad reputation. We can talk about why that is later, because I want to write a question for you in here myself. But that is one of the things, and I'll probably touch on a lot of the different things that we do in the lab in contrast as we're going through.
Yeah, not everybody has a nuclear generation site as part of their lab.
Absolutely. Well, it seems like we have quite a number of questions coming forward from the audience. I'll just pick one of them to follow on this lab discussion, right? The question goes like this: how can the system owners balance the trade-off between realism and safety when conducting penetration testing and adversary emulation on OT environment? And perhaps you can add some flavor, how is this conducted in lab environment that emulates?
Yeah, so I'll start, and then you can clean it up. But just like any other assessment that you're doing, I think you have to look at the scope that you want to apply and the objectives of your test. So obviously you don't know all of the tools that a pure adversary might use, but as Justin said, a lot of the black box tools that are available that are in general around are pretty much the same. They're not custom made as some may be. And so you also want to look at what the limits are of what you're willing to risk, right? So know your risk, know your objectives, know the scope, and then apply the proper tools as you're going forward. And I think that, especially once again, I'm U.S.-centric, but I know so many asset owners, want to know, what's behind the curtain. What exquisite thing does that adversary do? And only then can my pen test be realistic. It doesn't have to be that realistic. You don't have to be shot to understand that bullets can hurt you. And so you can use other methods to really rigorously test your system without fully employing the most radical tools that might be out there.
Right.
Yeah, I would add to that, if you're going to be doing a production network environment assessment, you generally are using common, off-the-shelf, often open source type tools to do that, or sometimes borrowing tools from engineers if you need a tool for a specific protocol. But if you're actually getting to a lab assessment and you're digging deeper into the device, I'll tell you right now, the first thing you're going to be doing in that lab setting is you're reverse engineering some component inside of that solution, and you're often needing to create a lot of your own tools. So those lab assessments can be very, very intense and very time-consuming because of that reverse engineering and creating your own testing harnesses.
Yeah, you should come over. We have a new program called Reverse Engineering at Scale.
Awesome.
And I figured that would get you there. So yeah, come on, visit.
Great opportunity.
So in real life, so asset owners.
Engineers always have to douse our fun.
In real life, not to the device level pen testing, just for vulnerability assessment is hard to get budget, right? So most of the time, asset owners, they don't conduct device level pen testing. It's usually done by Idaho National Laboratory, or it has done by ISA Secure, which certifies if you go to the system level embedded systems usually, and then there, it doesn't mean that if it's certified, it's cool. They have 4 levels that you have to pay attention for, starting from level 1 to level 4. And then another thing, I think the regulation, like in Europe, which is coming, Cyber Resilience Act, that they are demanding. So this is in real life. So in real life, when they do OT pen testing, most asset owners, they deploy like XDR, EDR solutions on their DMZ, and they want most of the pen testers to compromise and get to the PCN network. Once they get into the PCN network, for them, it's a game over.
Yeah, testing the access, which I was saying, that's what you're focusing on in production environment.
Yeah, and in terms of safety, I would say for legacy systems, it's very risky, yes, as Justin mentioned, for level 2, level 1 devices. However, right now, a lot of DCS systems, they have virtualized environment, and they have their own test bed already where they can perform penetration testing, and it has been done already widely.
Right. Yeah, and just to add to that, I definitely would agree that penetration tests in a production environment is more common for owner-operators. But if we're talking about lab assessments, just for clarity, I would say that 1/3 of all the penetration tests that we've done over the last 15 years have actually been for owner-operators. But it does tend to be the less expensive devices that are usually placed out where they're more exposed. And it's quite often as part of their decision in which vendor to go with, and that's where we tend to work with it the most. But for the bigger, more expensive, more mechanical process driven, it's usually more for the vendors themselves. And I've spent a lot of time in my career actually training penetration testing teams for the vendors in how to do that testing before they go to market with their products. And I would say that's probably about 50% of all of our tests that we do as a firm is doing that testing for vendors before they go to market with a product.
Right. Anything else that you want to add? Okay, cool. Yeah, talking about real life, we have a question about asking real life, right? So the question goes like this. If the existing system is very old, and trying to do a penetration testing, how shall we actually scope to conduct such a test? Right? Do we want to scope a subset of the system, entire system, or selected devices? How should we do that? And the panelists can go ahead to answer.
I'll say, Justin did cover a little bit of this, and so I'll give you an analogy. So I'm old. All right, and so when I go to the doctor and they say, "Hey, we're going to do a stress test on you. Get on this treadmill, right? And we're going to make you go faster, and then we're going to do an incline." But when they do that, they're standing there with the paddles, right? And, in case I have a heart attack, and they can. And so, you don't really want to really stress those old systems in those ways. But once again, you need to define the scope. You understand that there's risk in testing those components. So look at what you can realistically test. Is it, really, do you want to test your protections? What is the scope of your thing? Do you really want to know how can I impact that control device, or do you really want to know, are my protections from external connections actually mitigating potential risks to the system inside?
Yes, I fully agree, Zach, with you. We had a case where usually when you have legacy operating system, let's say Windows XP, you end up doing compensation controls. Let's say you deploy application whitelisting. So what you're trying to test, not to exploit the XP, but how you get around from the application whitelisting. So can you avoid this AV, AWL controls and then get over this? So I fully agree with that.
Yeah, and when we're talking about legacy environments, I can tell you, number one, that the least sensitive is going to be any software running on Windows or Linux tends to be the least sensitive. You can still knock it over. There's still a risk. You have to be careful. And the UDP services tend to be more sensitive than the TCP because when we do things like port scanning, we're not ever actually talking to the service. We're talking to the network stack, but that's not the case with UDP. Then when you go down and you start interacting with embedded devices, the embedded devices always are going to be more sensitive, always have to be more careful on. And if anybody wants to learn how to do things like just even something simple Nmap port scanning, which isn't malicious at all, go check out that document that I had recommended, that scanning highly sensitive networks, because there are specific configurations in Nmap that you need to make sure that you don't use, or other ones that you should use, to try to make sure you're not knocking over those embedded devices. In fact, in that document, I specify the 3 configurations inside of Nmap that are most likely to knock over an embedded device, and the older that embedded device is, the more likely that's going to occur. And the biggest reason why is a lot of our embedded devices that are old and legacy are usually either using a very old real-time operating system that has very poorly designed TCP/IP stacks, or worse, they have some type of bareback code, does not have a TCP/IP stack in it at all, and the engineer that wrote the firmware for that embedded device literally just went through and said, okay, well, I know that I need to do a SYN, ACK. They hard-coded inside of the system, and then they go ahead and they deal the response. And so when you start trying to use some of the more exotic features inside of Nmap, or even some of the basic features, it actually can knock those devices over. And I've seen them so bad that the Ethernet interface has a caching mechanism to hold packets and buffer the packets to coming in. I've seen such poorly written firmware that it doesn't even know how to query the buffer and check to see if there's something that's actually queued up ready for it. So that document will go through and recommend a whole bunch of recommendations about port scanning. And then beyond the port scanning, like I said, don't interact with the ICS protocols. That's the other major thing to make sure you're not killing your embedded devices in legacy environments, is don't do anything more than port scan any of the ICS protocols, and make sure when you port scan that you're using the special configurations that I recommend, and that you practice those before you ever do it in the real live environment. And then finally realize that I cannot ever guarantee 100% that you're not going to not knock something over. But I can tell you I've spent 16 years of my career trying to figure out what are the best settings that decrease the likelihood of knocking things over.
Awesome. Right. Yeah, indeed, testing in OT environment require more surgical level of precision on how do we want to do the testing. But on that point, Mr. Zach, just now you mentioned about, like an old man running a treadmill for a stress test. Have you ever seen someone, who is old running on the treadmill and fainted during the test itself? Which is, have you ever seen real world disaster or OT
like I
pen
said,
test?
that's why they stand there with the paddles, right? Once again, I'm sure the first time they killed somebody, that's when they said, "Oh, yeah, we should come back and have those paddles there." So.
Yeah, I was wondering whether is there like real world, examples of some of those systems, or that you heard of, some challenges that occurred during the course of like penetration testing, be it in your own experience or you heard from someone else.
Well, I think, as Justin alluded to, and I think when, say in the early days of DHS in the U.S., the early days of really caring about critical infrastructure, there was an overzealousness to run port scans, to run Nessus, Nmap, et cetera.
Yep.
And people were tipping over their production environments all the time.
Oh no.
And continued for a long time. I'm glad that I haven't heard those anecdotes for quite a while. Is there some wood? There's no wood here to knock on. But no, until people really started to sit back and take some of the steps, learn some of the lessons of penetration tests gone bad, that we started, studying it and get some of the protocols and procedures that Justin's been talking about and has been teaching for quite a while.
Absolutely. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I'm really interested in Salt's response. Let me inject something in, because I think she's going to have the best visibility of production environments that's there. I'm hoping. But from a more technical perspective, usually the most common thing that's going to occur if you do something wrong or you misconfigure a tool wrong, most of the time it's not going to damage the device that you're actually talking to, at least permanently. It may cause it to lock up, to freeze, or to reboot. Those are the most common things. But that's not the problem. The problem is if it locks up or if it reboots, what's going to happen to whatever you're producing, right, in the process itself, because that component's going to have some type of cascading failure inside of the process, which is why you don't ever do this while you're running production environments or producing anything. In fact, generally, the only time that you could actually, what we'd call brick a device, right, or damage a device where it's non-recoverable, usually is only when you're doing fuzzing of protocols against an embedded device. That's the most likely that's going to have something where the device is non-recoverable, the device itself that you're interacting with. Otherwise, most of the time, it's just rebooting or locking up the device.
So I will say that there is one environment that people do testing on that constantly goes down, and that's in wireless. So any people in telecoms here? So here at at the lab, I also have a test bed, a wireless test bed, and we always thought that oh man, all of the cellular vendors would want to come in and use our environment because we have this wonderful range and it's got low noise, and all the engineers said that's great, but the company itself says, why do I need to have a pristine test environment? If your call drops, you just think it's natural, and you start your call again. So they're just running all sorts of testing on their production environment all the time, with no loss in production, no loss in revenue, because we keep paying.
Miss Alternate.
So I don't have example of disaster, but it is very easy to create loss of view. So that's why if you're doing so, yeah, I have seen, and just do a IP conflict, you have a loss of view, and it's very easy to do IP conflict. And the second thing, if you're scanning all the machines, as Justin said be careful. If you're scanning all the machines, then you're creating loss of view to everything. If you're scanning one by one, then you created loss of view to one, which is not disaster quite. So.
Absolutely, very insightful. Well, just now we are talking about scoping, and we realize that cybersecurity is starting to get more and more colorful, right? You can see various sorts of colors: red, blue, and purple, right? So there's a question that goes like this: we need to do purple teaming, vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, threat modeling as part of the regulation as requirements. So, given that so many things that we need to do, what should we do first?
So, okay, I want to preface this. This is a joke, right? But I read this and I'm like, man, someone from KPMG must have written this regulation. Because it's like cha-ching.
Oh, I like that sound.
Yeah, I guess considering the breadth of things that have to be done, number one, I don't think that you would try to, you can't run them simultaneously. You probably would not even want to try to run them concurrently because you would have to assess the results from each different stage. But I think that, like once again, as Justin mentioned before, you want to do your security architecture review, which can, I would say go backwards. Look at that threat modeling could then come from that. That could then lead to your vulnerability assessment and your penetration testing. How you really call purple teaming kind of depends on you, but I would say that order might work.
Can I add? Yeah.
Yes,
So
please.
yeah, in my last session, I've broken down, I answered to this question actually, to the first thing Zach mentioned from threat perspective. So you're looking from threat perspective. And I mentioned we have actual threats, viable threats, potential threats. So potential threats, usually vulnerability, proof of concept exists, but the cybersecurity attack has not been observed, right? So in that case, in the beginning, you are doing risk assessment in order to define your cybersecurity requirements. You start from there. Then you have, let's say you have implemented, you need to do cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, and I included architecture review in the cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, with the configuration review, everything. So, and you are doing CSVA in order to see whether you have security measures in place. Is there any security gap or not? Then you do OT penetration testing to test, are we secure enough? But purple teaming, if I haven't seen much in OT environment.
No, I would agree. Pen test comes at last of the assessments of the environment, right? The penetration test generally would come last because, once again, you want to know as much as you can about the environment, and then when you do the penetration test, be very, very targeted, very specific in what you're trying to do. Don't just go pen test everything, right? That's not what you want to do inside of an OT environment. Be very, very specific on what you're going to do. When it comes into purple teaming or red teaming, right? Purple teaming and red teaming is not generally a test of the environment or purely of the environment. A red teaming exercise is partial test of the environment, but partial test of the blue team, the defenders, and how your team and company actually reacts. And then purple teaming is usually when there's going to be some type of a referee between the red team and the blue team that's trying to help maximize the outcome of that red teaming exercise. So just remember, when you talk about red teaming, purple teaming, right, that's either partially or fully testing the human response capability, not just the environment. That's why penetration testing should be very clearly distinguished different than a red teaming exercise.
Right. Yeah, indeed. And also, as mentioned by Ms. Sultanet about the importance of risk assessment, and multiple things have to happen during that course of risk assessment. And I believe that we will also consider what are some of the realistic threat actors that we are trying to defend ourselves against, right? And we have a question that comes like this, that, he or she will be wondering, how the system owners could balance the trade-off between the realism. Because if you want to be as realistic, we will want to emulate threats coming from real-world threat actors. How do they actually execute their TTPs and etc., while balancing safety when conducting the pen test, as well as the adversarial simulation on OT environment.
That's not a pen test. That's a red teaming exercise.
Red teaming, all right.
Because you're testing the TTPs of a specific threat actor. right? That's a red teaming exercise where you are testing the environment, but you're also testing the blue team's defenses in spotting those TTPs. Right?
Awesome.
So a penetration test is finding as many vulnerabilities as you can in the most efficient manner possible. Red teaming is actually trying to model your traffic to be as nearly identical of who you're trying, the threat actor you're trying to model, right? Or just trying to be as stealthy as possible if you're not specifically modeling somebody.
Yeah, in terms of red teaming, so big companies, if they have, let's say, 20 manufacturing sites around the world, as Rob mentioned, they are standardized now. They're quite identical in terms of architecture. So what they're practicing is they're doing in one site, let's say pen test, the findings is applicable to all the sites, so they're red teaming. And another companies, let's say oil and gas that I have seen around the globe, in their headquarters, they have red team who come like in one year, they go side by side and they do this penetration testing from red team perspective. But for small companies, for small plants, it's quite luxury, I would say, to have red team in there.
So I'll take a somewhat different view. So if you're a large manufacturer and you have 20 or 100 sites, what do they say? If you've seen one site, you've seen one site. So even when they try to be standardized, components are different from year to year, different changes. Once you've spent 3 years making this one site and you're parallel building somewhere else, you find some differences that you want to make. You make improvements. So even large companies that do try to standardize, they may standardize on a vendor, but they may never be able to standardize on an environment. And so that's one of the reasons a lot of people like to be on that red team, because if you went to 20 or 100 of the same sites all the time, you'd be kind of bored. But working for that large company, you really never see the same thing every time, and you're constantly learning and constantly providing new value added.
It depends, as Marco said. In OT, everything is depends.
And that's why it's important to work with the engineer, right? Because the engineer is going to have a better idea of how similar those environments are. So just if you're a security team, always be very, very careful on your assumptions on how identical or how similar the sites are going to be. Work with the engineering team to do it. And when you are testing one and inferring that the others have similar types of risks, be very, very careful with that inference that's there. Because something that I've learned a long time ago, right? If you have 100 children and you give them the same exact Lego set and you ask them to build a car, you're going to have 100 different cars. And to some degree, the OT environment is very similar to these Lego sets. We often have assumptions for how this component talks to this component, talks to this component, talks to this component in OT environment. But yet we also, if you see enough sites, you start seeing these devices configured in such ways that is very different than what your assumptions, your understanding of normal would be. Work with the engineers. They're your best friends, right? Have them come up with the scenarios. Work with your engineers and say, hey, what type of scenario are we actually working with? And then if we're doing a penetration test, right, show that we can do a penetration test to get to a point where I could cause that behavior, but without actually causing that behavior. So for instance, one example I like to share quite often when I'm teaching my Assessing and Exploiting Control Systems course at Black Hat, I like sharing the story with my students that about 2 years ago, we did a penetration test, or a security architecture review of a breakfast cereal manufacturing plant, right? So manufacturing breakfast cereal for children. And working with the engineer, we were talking about what are the maximum impacts that we could actually cause, and we talked about, how could we actually, cause harm to the operators? How could we actually cause financial damage to the company? And then from the last perspective, well, how could we cause harm to your customers? In this case, children. And so the question I asked, and I'd be very, very careful with how I phrased this because it was a very sensitive question, but I had to ask the engineer responsible for the system, is there any way that we can poison children with your processes? And he had to really think about that. He took him off base a little bit, but after he started thinking about it, we started brainstorming between me and him. We actually came up with a way with their existing system that an attacker, if properly did the attack, could possibly poison children by spraying cleaning chemicals, right? through the same sprouts, they actually spray the sugar onto the cereal. Their process actually had a cleaning mechanism where they would actually use a chemical on there, and then they would actually flush the chemical out because they would manufacture different breakfast cereals on that same manufacturing line. So they had a cleaning process and a flushing process, and then they would start producing again. And the cleaning chemicals were fairly benign, right? But with enough concentration that could eventually cause some type of a problem, and they knew exactly what it was, which is why they had the flushing process. But we did find a way that we actually could spray chemicals, cleaning chemicals on the breakfast cereal instead of sugar.
You monster.
I know. Penetration tester. I mean, like I said, but it's kind of fun, and this is a penetration tester. I can't emphasize enough. You have to work with the engineers. The engineers are the experts of the processes, right? They're the experts of what's going to be the maximum impact of the biggest risk that we actually have. The penetration tester is the expert to try to figure out how to accomplish that through the environment. But really, the most effective team is when you're working together.
Absolutely, totally agree with you. And in fact, to do a good pen testing, I will agree that you need to have a good threat scenario, right? And to have a good threat scenario, you have to wear the hat as a monster. Yeah, but talking about that, I think you also mentioned a good point, which is work together with the engineers. And I would also believe that we don't have enough cybersecurity professionals. We have to use this opportunity to recruit them as our extended team so that we can actually make it overall more effective. Right, and talking about that, I think at the OT system itself, there are many different modular components and perhaps parts, I would say, right? And just now you also mentioned that pen tests have different levels of pen tests. You can actually pen test at the parts level or components level, right? On that part, there's a question from the floor asking that, how do we actually get permission, or not sure whether is there a need to get a permission from the vendors to do such a testing itself?
So I want to start with this because this is kind of the question that I was going to ask you because I know what we have to do. And number one, I would say it probably varies from nation to nation, depending on the laws on reverse engineering or doing other things. But some of the work that we do are cyber testing for resilient ICS, so Citrix program. The first year was spent building the legal framework and getting the first vendor to come in and say, yes, you may destroy this piece of equipment. If you find vulnerabilities that we don't know about, here's how we're going to do responsible disclosure. Here's the scope for your test. And if you go outside the scope, then you violated the agreement, and then we're going to come out after you. And so that was going to be my question to you is, if you find a vulnerability that has not been documented, do you always disclose? Do you have an agreement with whichever customer you're doing the work for? How do you handle that?
That's a really good question. So about 50% of the penetration test that InGuardians does is actually for the vendors themselves, and they're engaging us. And so that's really easy because they said this is what you want to test, and we're like, all right, here's what we're going to charge, and we sign the agreement and we just do it. So that's the easy one to do it because we're not approaching them. When it comes down to working with owner-operators, if I'm doing an assessment for an owner-operator, that's where I have to, because of my contract and my NDA with the owner-operator, I have to report the vulnerability to the owner-operator because I have an NDA with that owner-operator. And then that owner-operator usually is legally responsible because of their support contract to report it back to the vendor themselves. But one thing I always do is I will always volunteer to any of my customers. And I say, I will volunteer free, no charge at all, jump on that call. When you call to report it in your vendor, I will be willing to make myself available to join that call and help explain it to the vendors, because to me, that's a benefit to me to get to know the vendors better and to know their teams that are there. And it also helps make sure that that right information gets to that vendor, so I actually have a better odds of that vendor actually properly remediating that vulnerability. But yeah, that's always the problem. And if my customer does not report that back up to the vendor, right, that's something that I'm usually restricted and don't have any recourse to do at that point, unless I go talk to a lawyer about what my options are.
Yeah. And I want to say, Honeywell has been forward-leading on this, for almost 20 years. So I don't know if you've been involved in any of those disclosures from a company perspective or from a system perspective.
Yeah, a lot of vendors actually in Honeywell as well. It's not only we engage, there is also the programs like bug bounty, so everyone can find the vulnerability and disclose to the, there is a procedure for disclosement, everything. But another, here you were talking about vulnerabilities on the device, on the software, right? But
So, yeah, software or hardware embedded
hardware,
device.
yeah. These programs are out there. A lot of vendors are working collaboratively together. They're encouraging. So I know some of our pen testers in Hall of Fame in many vendors' website. But let's take shift from different perspective, like doing penetration in production environment. Like it doesn't relate to the vulnerability on the device. It can be misconfiguration issue, right? Let's say it's a misconfiguration in any security controls, like for example, let's take in detail application whitelisting, you put the enforcement mode in a medium or less, low. So when you try to do this penetration testing to the production environment, it is very critical to get the vendor approval, because tomorrow if this pen tester third party is coming in and causing some damage, the vendor is coming to help you most of the time. So yeah, approval and collaboration is very important, because most of the time, if it's a third party, doesn't know the system itself, I cannot say from the Honeywell perspective, but vendor might say no, because it's way too risky.
Yeah, and that's actually good emphasis right there. Something I had on the slide that I had verbally mentioned, which we definitely should re-emphasize, is the fact that if you're doing work for an owner-operator, there is a high probability where you may need to sign a contract with the vendor itself, right, and engage with that vendor. And for us, I would say it's maybe 50% of the time we're working with the owner-operator that we actually are signing contracts or agreements with the vendor themselves. Let me introduce yet another category about reporting. What about if you are an independent researcher and you need to report vulnerabilities? My personal recommendation is if you're an independent researcher and you had purchased the equipment, right, or legally found some way to obtain the equipment, we're staying on the legal side here. My personal recommendation is to go ahead and if you find a vulnerability, if you know somebody inside of the vendor that's responsible for the vulnerability program, feel free to report it directly to them. Or if it's a large ICS vendor that is well known to work with the community, like a Siemens or a Honeywell, right, you feel free to use some of their reporting channels. But otherwise, my primary recommendation is if you're an independent security researcher, my recommendation is report your vulnerabilities through CISA. And I know that's through the United States, and we're not in the United States, but CISA tends to be the clearinghouse for most vulnerabilities inside of the ICS world. And CISA will make sure that when you report the vulnerability, they'll get it to the vendor in the fastest way possible, and they will also make sure and work with the vendor to try to get things actually fixed and addressed, and also will make sure that if you want recognition for being the one that found it, CISA will make sure you have that recognition. And that's, from a legal and liability perspective, it's the safest way for an independent researcher to report vulnerabilities, right? But if you're working for an owner-operator and as part of the owner-operator you find a vulnerability, your support contract usually requires you to report it directly to the vendor and not through CISA.
Yep. And if it does go to CISA, then somebody in Idaho tends to validate it at some point as well. Just saying.
I don't know who that would be. I don't know.
Well, it's not me, but
I hear it's a good team.
It's probably someone I know. Yeah, they're a good team. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a very engaging discussion. Probably looking at the time, we still have one last question. I'll just put it forward over here. Yeah, looking forward with the crystal ball, right? We are starting to see some trends that, we have a blending with IT, IoT, OT, a lot of different things get blended together. With this change, right, how does it actually affect, the way that we are going to conduct security assessments forward, right? Is it closer to how are we doing now for OT systems, which is a little bit more conservative, or are we doing it more like IT type of systems? How are you going to do it?
Adapt your testing to whatever environment you're working on, right?
Right.
You can't do a pen test the same way every single time. Depending on the environment you're working on, you're gonna have different levels of risk that you can spend. You can have different sensitivities in the environment, right? Make sure that you're conscious of what the requirements are, conscious of what the risks are, and change what you're doing to be appropriate for that environment.
And I would also say, so number one, this almost comes to the soapbox thing I like. I am one who does not believe in IT and OT convergence, right? However, we know that they are tightly coupled.
Yep.
But the people in the OT environment, the people that understand physical processes, are probably not going to be the same people that really understand how to be a virtuoso with root or work a database. So if you have a blended environment, lots of IoT devices, lots of different esoteric wireless things, IT, OT, you need to build a team.
Yeah.
And you need to work together. So back to your work with the engineers, both in your own team, but also with whoever you're doing the assessment on, because the more the complex environment is, the more you need to work on the team, but also remember the more complex the environment is, the more misconfigurations may happen, different types of pathways that may come into to compromise.
I want to mention more in continuous assessment. So Zach was mentioning complex environments, a lot of equipment. So right now, I think we are lucky since we have already ICS products in place, which gives us continuous assessment, saying that they has been tested with a lot of vendors compatibility issue and has been approved to use, like for the misconfiguration. For example, let's say you hardened your system. When you harden your system, you harden according to the CIS benchmark plus according to the vendor's benchmark, right? And you reach some score, 95%. You disabled all your systems, unnecessary services, and then close the ports, yeah? But then misconfiguration happens. And you need to spot this. So make it this automatic to spot it, like a continuous security configuration assessment. This is the one thing. Another thing, add the file integrity monitoring. Usually a file has 3, yeah, addition, deletion, and modification. And then utilize the detection when you go to the level 1, level 2 right now. They're doing a great job in terms of anomaly detection. If there is some unexpectedly write command issued to the PLC. And plus, it is already integrated a lot of tools with CISA, with the MITRE, with the NVDT database, so you can leverage all these tools. But you have to keep in mind that you cannot bring the IT-related tool and just deploy in your tool. There is a huge difference because you cannot put the agent and do all the scanning here. Okay, I'm scanning for vulnerability. You need to, from architecture-wise, to have a less noise, which is approved by the vendor. I was giving them an example, like, let's make it, let's say if it's agent, it's just collecting the information, sending out to the separate server, which is doing all the scanning process, and make it in scheduled based.
Yeah, and also use your experience. You know, when you, once again, have a complex environment, there are some, you know, small misconfigurations or a certain situation that may bring you down for one reason or another. Remember that. Test against it, you know, the next year and the year after. I know several, you know, okay, so many people that look at exploitation will look at the ways things happen either naturally or inadvertently and try to mimic those. When they go in. So yeah, when your mother locks up your computer by doing something, you know, 5 times wrong, try to do that when you come and do your own testing in the environment. And sometimes it may even you know, fool some of the protection mechanisms.
Yeah, and I would also add that when you're doing these types of assessments, right, in order to make sure we're doing it properly and safeguarding things properly inside of an OT environment, I think it's critical that we have dedicated individuals doing cybersecurity, not just the testers, but all cybersecurity governance and down. We need to have dedicated individuals. Now, to me, it doesn't matter if they report through engineering or if they are a sub-team of the IT security team. To me, the most effective I've seen across all the biggest change to be effective is having dedicated individuals, right? So the people that are going into the OT environment are always the same ones going in, so they're working with the engineers on a daily basis, and they're learning the nuances of the difference of their environment. And to kind of quickly add on to something that you had mentioned, I personally like the idea of IT-OT convergence, however, not in the way that most people understand, okay? Many of us have had math, right? What are 2 converging lines in math? Are 2 converging lines the same line, or are they just becoming closer together? Okay, in math, 2 converging lines are completely different vectors that never become one vector, right? That's the best way to think of IT-OT convergence. We want more similarity with the robustness and the governance and the capabilities we have inside of IT, but we need to do it uniquely for the OT environment. So if you have some tools in IT that you want, something like Active Directory or identity management or vulnerability scanning or backup solutions, great, let's do the same thing inside of OT.
but a different management deployment of it, properly configured for the OT environment.
I like the analogy where you use the vector space to visualize how the convergence looks like. Right, awesome. So to close this panel discussion, and if you have a piece of advice for the audience, and if you can summarize them in about 12 words, what would that be? 12 to 15 words.
140 characters?
Characters, yeah. My buffer size is very small. Yeah.
Honestly, my recommendation for penetration testing, be careful, right? Don't automatically say no, but at the same time, it is not an automatic yes either. It takes time and effort to make sure you're doing it safely.
Awesome.
And you know, as he said, it's a team sport, so make sure you bring the right team there and listen to all the players.
Before doing OT penetration tests, I think do your homework first, like then go for OT pen test.
Yeah, specialized training, right, and making sure you're testing those techniques in a test environment before you ever touch production. Production environments are risky. You're not getting away from that. It's just we have to measure the risk.
Awesome. If I may add, I would just add one. What have been right may not always be right. Right? It depends on the context and environment. Right. All right. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you, Dan, for very insightful and exciting sharing. Right. Thank you.